Thank you, Severin, for that lovely introduction. Obviously, voting is an issue of quite considerable interest these days, especially with COVID-19 complicating everything. There's a lot we have to talk about. In particular, how did we get computers so involved with our voting? Because that's why we're here today, to talk about these issues. And this really dates back to, we can all blame Florida 2000, and in fact, Florida 2002, which was the midterm, because they had problems then too. But we all remember the pregnant chads, the hanging chads, and all the issues related to the debacle in Florida. One of the problems is that a lot of people drew the conclusion from that paper is bad and paperless is good. And in fact, what happened in Florida was not that the use of paper was bad, it was a technology that was using the paper that was bad. It was these punch card machines that were bad. But because this wrong conclusion was drawn by a lot of people, the feeling was if we can get computers involved, they will never make mistakes, they will always do the right thing. And in fact, paperless is good because we just saw the paper was bad. So because of the Florida midterm in 2002, the Help America Vote Act was passed by Congress, signed by the president, allocating almost $4 billion for new voting machines. These machines were accompanied by phenomenal vendor promises. The machines would be secure. They were federally certified, although that's a bit of a stretch. The way they talked about that, as I'll mention later, you could just push a button at the end of the day and get the results and go home. And obviously, this idea appealed enormously to election officials because election day is a really tiring experience. I mean, I worked as a poll worker back in 2004, and I was exhausted afterwards, and I was just a poll worker. So for election officials who are working on this nonstop for a long, long time, it's really exhausting. So these computers had enormous appeal, especially with all of the promises that accompanied them. Furthermore, the Help America Vote Act had a deadline for spending this money, which resulted in a gold rush mentality. So people were out to get the newest and the greatest and spend the money and show their voters that they were on top of the issues. So most of the machines that were produced then, not all, but one of the major types of machines that came out of that were called direct recording electronic, or DREs. These machines were mostly paperless initially, and they were called direct electronic recording because they presented the ballot, the voter used them to vote on these machines, and they directly recorded the results into the electronics of the machine. As I said, because they were paperless, then the idea was that these machines didn't make mistakes, they couldn't be hacked. I mean, that wasn't really discussed very much in those early days, but computer scientists, of course, figured this out right away. And a lot of the early opposition to these machines came from the computer science community, which was a little bit ironic. There were times when we were called Luddites because we were opposing the use of computers in this fashion in voting by people who typically didn't really understand how computers work. These machines were also badly engineered because they were paperless. You could not do a recount. And the technology that was used on the screen frequently, it often required calibration, frequent calibration. And if it wasn't done often enough, there would be situations where a voter would touch candidate A and candidate B would light up. And many people took this as proof that the election was being rigged. And I have to say, I don't think that that's the case at all, because if I wanted to rig an election, or if I had a colleague who was a really good hacker to rig the election for me, I wouldn't do it this way. I wouldn't make it so obvious. You can just go in and mess with the memory and rig the election that way. So I think it was mainly a calibration issue when you see these jumping votes. But of course, there's an element of non-determinism in all of this because you don't know which candidate actually got the vote. Furthermore, because people had to vote on these machines, which were computers, failure or an insufficient number of them could result in long lines. And we saw this over and over and over again in elections in this century, where long lines were formed because there weren't enough machines, or in some cases because they failed. So because of the complaints about these paperless machines and the call for a paper trail, voter verified paper audit trails were developed. And many of these DRE machines, these models were retrofitted for these paper audit trails. There was supposed to be hard copy backup that could be used to recount an election or to do an audit if there were questions about the results. But they were, again, badly engineered. They tended to be continuous roll thermal printed papers, which that's the kind of paper you get in a gas station. As you know, it easily fades. It can be hard to read even before it fades because they were continuous rolls. They were hard to recount. I mean, if you want to do recount, you want to sort things into piles and count each pile. You don't want to have to read things off of a continuous roll of thermal printed paper. And furthermore, these machines typically came with plastic covers or some kind of cover over this paper, which could make it even harder to read. There was an MIT study that was done shortly after these machines came out. And what they found was that few people bothered to check these voter verified paper audit trails. And most didn't even realize that they were intended as backup for the vote. Now, if people don't check, then they're really not very useful, because then if you have a cheating machine, it could change what's on the thermal printed roll. And if nobody checks, it won't get caught. And if somebody does check, if very few people check, they'll probably figure they made a mistake. So they really are not particularly effective. They're better than paperless. That's about all you can say. The testing and certification of these machines was also questionable, especially in the early years. The Help America Vote Act created voluntary federal guidelines, but voluntary is the key word. So there are no requirements, absolute requirements, but many states require that their machines satisfy these guidelines. So they're almost like required guidelines. Initially, the first guidelines that were created had minimal security requirements, really minimal, and accessibility testing. They were more designed for the way you might have requirements for some sort of commercial object like a toaster. So it should be able to withstand heat extremes, dropping, and so on. But they didn't have requirements, for example, for penetration testing or other kinds of testing that you really want to do, excuse me, with computers. So in 2006, California conducted the first really good independent review of these systems called the top to bottom review. It involved many University of California experts, computer scientists, cybersecurity experts, accessibility experts, even attorneys. And they tested the three major systems, and they were all bad. They had bad security and bad accessibility. California's testing was followed on by Ohio, which conducted their Everett test in 2007. They confirmed everything that California found, and they found additional problems. So I'm going to jump now to 2020 and talk about the various options that we have now. So one obviously is in-person voting, but with COVID-19, that's made more complicated. Typically, poll workers are elderly, and these folks are not volunteering for good reason, because they're at greatest risk for getting very sick from COVID-19. So we need volunteers, and it's probably not too late to volunteer at your polling place, your local polling place. So I urge people to think about volunteering. It's pretty eye-opening, and of course, and it gives you a different perspective on elections and also on the other volunteers. Every time I vote in person now, I always thank the volunteers, because I know how much work it is. Now, again, in many parts of the country, we still have voting machines, and they can break down, which can disenfranchise voters who go to the polls. I'll be talking about some of that a bit later. Hand-marked paper ballots are the least expensive and most reliable technology. And the idea is that the voter marking the ballot means that the voter has actually checked it, as opposed to these like voter verified paper audit trails I talked about. It's true they can make mistakes, but it's much more reliable because the voter has selected what she wants, and we know that she's marked, in almost all cases, what she intended. And so that's the best approach. It's also cheaper, a lot cheaper than these machines. And it has the backup option that if there's a delay with the scanner, because these paper ballots, again, are read by scanners typically in the polling place. So there could be a line for the scanner, or the scanner could be down. If that happens, then these ballots can still be deposited in the ballot box. So basically, with voter marked paper ballots, you're not going to get the long lines that you could get when you are using machines. There are new machines that are out on the market that have come out in the past couple of years called ballot marking devices. And these tend to be quite expensive. They're supposed to be accessible. There's been some testing which has shown that they're not always so accessible. By accessible, I mean that they're easy to use by voters with disabilities. Most of these machines print only the voter's selection on a paper ballot. So they actually do print out the results, which is good, on a paper ballot, which is definitely more readable than these old thermal printed paper ballots. They weren't even ballots, they were just records. So these are ballots. So there are several commercial ones, and then Los Angeles also has produced their own ballot marking device, and it lists every race with a no selection for those where the voter didn't vote. So if that was unintended, the voter can request a new option for voting. Some of these new machines don't include that. So it just gives you a list of your choices. And if you inadvertently omitted a race, or if you voted for a race and it's not included on the ballot, you may not catch that. So this no selection feature is something that they should all have. So we have ballot marking devices now that are being used in parts of a number of states and in all of Georgia. So everybody going to the polling place in Georgia must vote on these machines, the ones that they bought. There have been a number of problems with these ballot marking devices. Early results suggest that voters don't do a good job of verifying these either. There seems to be a tendency on the part of, I guess, the general population to trust what the computer produces. Obviously, those of us who who do programming, who are deeply involved with computers, don't have that trust, but many people do. So these early results suggest that people don't necessarily check these ballots that have been printed out for them. Some of these machines have internal scanners, so they're sort of all in one device, as opposed to having a separate scanner for the paper ballots. These internal scanners are definitely a bad design. So ES&S, which is the major vendor, produces a machine that Andrew Appel labeled permission to cheat machine because it gives the voter the option after she's voted of not viewing the ballot before it's sucked into the scanner. And that's always a bad idea, because then if the machine knows you haven't viewed the ballot, it could change the ballot. The Dominion Indian cast evolution is also problematic, because for that machine, the ballot passes under the printer en route to the scanner. I think it does for the express vote also. And that gives the scanner an opportunity to print additional material on the ballot. Now, on September 26th, Georgia discovered a flaw with their new ballot marking devices. Remember, everybody voting in person in Florida in Georgia, has to use these machines. So the Senate race has a lot of candidates in Georgia. So many, in fact, that the people who were designing the ballot decided to put the candidate names in 2 columns. However, logic and accuracy testing, which was done just shortly before they were going to start using these machines, discovered that on occasion, the second column of names can disappear, which the state claims happen only when the machine is turned on. But whether or not that's the case, you don't want voters going to vote on these machines and not having a list of all the candidates in the race. Consequently, the vendor has agreed to reprogram about 30,000 machines across 159 counties between when the flaw when the fix was produced and when early voting starts on October 12th. So again, anybody who's done bug fixes knows this is a terrible idea. Even if it's a trivial fix, you can't be sure that there hasn't been some repercussion elsewhere that you just weren't aware of. And there's obviously not adequate timing for testing the bug fixes. Furthermore, there is the risk that some insider might introduce malware into this fix, which could certainly have a major implication on the election. And again, as a reminder of what can happen really with quick last-minute software fixes, that's what Boeing did with their 737 MAX, and we saw the tragic results of having inadequate testing there. So there are mail-in ballots, and of course, a lot of voters are planning to do that, but those have potential problems too. There's a significant increase in demand for mail-in ballots in 2020, including in a number of states which have changed their laws to make it easier to do mail-in ballots, but haven't done it extensively in the past. So they don't have a lot of experience to fall back on, and they've had to scurry to get the resources they need, like the high-speed scanners, to count these ballots in a timely fashion. In addition, there have been legal issues. An example is Pennsylvania. in September 17th, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court said that ballots postmarked by election day could be counted up to 3 days after election. So as long as they're postmarked by election day, if they arrive within 3 days after the election, they would be included in the count. They said drop boxes were okay, but they also said naked ballots should be rejected, and I'll mention what that is in a second. But getting back to the delayed count, the delayed acceptance, on September 22nd, which is only 5 days later, the Pennsylvania Republican Party announced they were appealing the 3-day rule to the United States Supreme Court. So as of now, that is still up in the air, whether or not Pennsylvania is going to be allowed to accept ballots that arrive within 3 days after the close of the election. Now, this naked ballot situation is really bizarre. In many cases, certainly in California where I vote, people are given you get 2 envelopes with your ballot. There's an inner envelope where you're supposed to put your ballot, has no identifying information whatsoever. And then you should put that inner envelope in an outer envelope, which contains all of your information, your name, your signature, and any other information that's needed to verify that you're a valid mail-in ballot voter. So that goes on the outer envelope, and once the ballots are processed, that outer envelope is checked and then removed, and then the inner envelope protects the secrecy of the ballot, the privacy of the ballot. And the Pennsylvania Supreme Court said that if a ballot is sent without an inner envelope, it should be rejected. So that's a bit of a strange ruling. In the past, that's not been a problem. The problem with sending a naked ballot is that you give up your secret ballot, but not that your ballot should be rejected. So that was a kind of odd and disturbing ruling. The other thing that happens with mail-in ballots is sometimes they can't be read by the scanners, and then they have to be manually recopied. And obviously that can introduce a whole host of other issues. So with mail-in ballots, you have to do pre-processing. First, as I say, you take this you look at the outer envelope, if there are 2. Anyway, the envelope the ballot comes in, and you separate it by ballot style, which is basically saying from where are you voting, what municipality or district, and so on. And there's a signature comparison made to see if it matches the signature on record. If it does, then the voter registration database, you're marked as having voted in that database. If it doesn't match, or if it's missing, then there are one of 2 possibilities. If this pre-processing is done early enough, then the state has the option, and many states do this, of providing the voter with the possibility of fixing or curing the ballot. So in other words, go to some location and prove that you are who you said you were, or some other form of proof of getting your ballot accepted. In states that don't do pre-processing, and there are a number of critical ones that don't, it's not going to be possible to do this. So if you forget to sign, or if your signature doesn't match the signature they have on record, or if somebody decides it doesn't match, your ballot won't be counted. So then the identifying information is removed. Some states don't have these 2 sets of ballots. Some states have only 1, with information on the outer ballot that can be removed, so that your ballot, of the outer envelope that can be removed, so your ballot is still kept secret, and your information has been removed from the outer envelope. So here's what happens with pre-processing. I'm just focusing on some of the battleground states here. So some states do pre-processing, and they do this upon receipt of the ballot. So Georgia, Minnesota, North Carolina, and Nevada are 4 such states that do that. Some states allow pre-processing at least a week before Election Day. That includes Arizona, Florida, Ohio, and Texas. Some states less than a week before Election Day: Iowa, Michigan, and New Hampshire. And then on Election Day itself, Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, and you can see that that's going to create problems, because that means that certainly those states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, almost certainly, 100% certain, will not have their final results on election night, because they're going to be still counting ballots. Many states also allow ballots to arrive after Election Day. We talked about Pennsylvania before. California may be the most extreme. Here, ballots that are received up to 17 days after Election Day are accepted if they have been postmarked by Election Day. Now, again, scanners tabulate almost all paper ballots, whether they're hand-marked or machine-produced. And they're computers, they can have software bugs, and they can be hacked. So there are a couple of myths around voting machines and scanners that I've heard repeatedly, many of us have heard repeatedly from people who know better. One is because voting machines or scanners are never connected to the internet, they can't be hacked. And this is unfortunately not true. Machines can be hacked even if they aren't never connected to the internet. For each election, both the scanners and the voting machines need to be programmed. For that particular election, they have to be told who the candidates are and where their positions are on the ballot. And that programming is done by a separate computer. And then it's fed into the machines or the scanners, usually by some sort of removable memory card or something like that. If the machine that did the programming is itself hacked, and many of these machines frequently are at some point connected to the internet, then they can pass the malware onto the voting machines or the scanners, even though those themselves were never connected to the internet. An example, which I'm sure you all remember, is the Iranian centrifuges that self-destroyed about a decade ago. They were infected by the Stuxnet virus. Those centrifuges were never connected to the internet, but some devices that were connected to the internet that then talked to the centrifuges were infected. The second myth is that there's so many different types of systems that you can't rig an election. And I don't know why anybody even believes this for a minute, because of course we have the Electoral College now. And so you don't have to rig all the different systems. You don't have to rig all the different states. All you have to do is focus on a few swing states. And even there, you don't have to rig the entire state. All you have to do is rig swing districts. The good news is that we can protect voting technology. The way to do it is to have voter marked paper ballots, ideally hand marked. We have to have devices like ballot marking devices for use by voters with disabilities who cannot hand mark paper ballots. So such a device should be available at every polling place, but most voters should be using hand marked paper ballots. There needs to be a strong chain of custody of these ballots. This is something that we know how to do. It should be done. And again, that's an important step for the security of elections. And then finally, these paper ballots should be used to audit the machines that count them, because these machines could have software bugs or malware. And the gold standard for doing that is a statistically based manual post-election ballot audit called risk limiting audits. And I want to stress manual because you don't want to use computers that check on computers, because then you have a cascading possibility of infections if the checking computers get infected and so on. So a little more about risk limiting audits. They should be conducted after preliminary results are announced, because remember, they are checking on the machines that count these ballots. So the machines have to commit to a result before they get checked. And of course, it's critical that this happen before the results are certified. And just as a side note, there's a lot of reforms that need to be done for our elections. Some of them have to do with state laws and with restrictions with deadlines that are unrealistic, especially now that computers are so widely used in elections. There needs to be adequate time in state laws for audits or recounts to be conducted before certification has to be done. So that's an area where we basically need to get our attorney friends involved. The ballots have to be randomly selected and manually counted. The idea of a risk limit is the largest chance that a wrong outcome will not be corrected. It basically gives a guaranteed pre-specific chance that only within the risk limit will, in other words, if the risk limit is 10%, if you have a 10% risk limiting audit, there's at least a 90% chance that if there is a wrong outcome, if the original count was wrong, it'll be corrected. Basically, if there's an initial problem uncovered as you're doing these audits, you're going to look at more ballots, and you're going to continue doing that until either you can declare with very high confidence that the results were correct, or you do a total manual recount, which will determine the correct results. So risk limiting audits are going to be done to some extent in 2020, not nearly as much as we would like to see. There The state of Colorado was the first state to do these. They passed a law, and in 2018, they did the first statewide risk limiting audit. Of course, they're going to do it again this year. Rhode Island and Georgia passed laws that are going to have them conduct risk limiting audits in 2020. In Michigan and Pennsylvania, the secretaries of states want to do risk limiting audits. They don't necessarily have the authority to order it, but there have been pilot risk limiting audits in both of these states, and we are hoping that they will both conduct statewide risk limiting audits because, of course, it's the state count that matters because of the Electoral College. If they're unable to do risk limiting audits, we still have high confidence that they will do good audits because we've got good people running these elections, and they will do good audits. They just might not be quite as good as the risk limiting audit would be. Virginia has a law, but it's a little bit funky because they're unlikely to conduct their risk limiting audit before the recount deadline. Arizona is hoping to have risk limiting audits in every county. And most swing states have reasonable audit laws, not necessarily risk limiting audits, but reasonable audit laws. Florida is an exception. Florida remains the outlier. Florida, after Florida 2000, it's like they said, we're never going to do any more statewide recount again, and they've written laws to make it very hard to do that. So I want to talk a little bit about internet voting because we're hearing from some quarters that a way around problems with the Postal Service is to have people vote over the internet. And I just want to say for the record, that's a terrible idea. But to define what internet voting is, it's the return of the voted ballot over the internet via web, email, or fax, using your personal computer, tablet, smartphone. It's not the same. So if blank ballots are sent out over the internet, we don't consider that internet voting. So it's only the return of the voted ballot. There is ongoing crypto research to try to come up with secure ways of doing internet voting, but prominent cryptographers, including one who's actually written an internet voting system, are opposed they're opposed to internet voting for the foreseeable future because of all the risks. And again, there are no regulations, standards, or independent testing, government oversight, legal accountability, or ability to do a recount for any kind of internet voting. It's just been ignored in terms of requirements. Nonetheless, internet voting is used in the United States, in roughly 30 states for military and overseas voters. Also this year, there have been some pilot real elections and small elections where all of the citizens could vote over the military, not just military, and over the internet, not just military. The supporters of these pilot elections, of course, have declared them to be secure, although they have no way to know that really, without violating the secret ballot. But assuming that there was no attempt to hack them, the obvious question is, why would anyone hack a pilot? I mean, if I want to mess with elections, I'm not going to hack a pilot. I'm going to wait until the people advocating this insecure type of technology convince themselves and others that it's secure, and then start using it for major elections before I'm going to hack anything. So these pilots are really a joke. And I hope that if you hear of anybody talking about doing an internet voting pilot, you will push back really hard. Now, again, because internet voting is so insecure, the MOVE Act was passed in 2009 rather. It provides online, it requires states to provide online blank ballots for military overseas voters at least 45 days in advance of an election. So then the voter can download this blank ballot, print it out, mark it, and return it via postal mail, not internet. There's expedited postal mail return for the military. So really, there's very little need for military voters to have internet voting because of this expedited return. Obviously, in any situation, there are going to be some voters who won't be able to get their ballots in on time, but that'll be true no matter what you do. By and large, this is a problem that's been solved. British Columbia, a few years ago, the province of British Columbia decided to contemplate, they wanted to consider internet voting. So they commissioned a $400,000 study to examine internet voting because it was widely done in the province of Ontario in municipalities. So they had multiple elections and data to analyze. And what they discovered was not only did internet voting not increase voting participation in general, but much to everyone's surprise, it didn't increase voting by young people. What they found, in fact, was that the people who voted over the internet tended to be the people who would have voted anyway. Now, admittedly, this study was done before smartphones became widely used, but there's certainly no well-known study, no legitimate study that suggests that internet voting will increase voter participation, even though a lot of people believe that it will. And of course, we have to worry with internet voting about possible nation-state attacks. The bipartisan Senate Intelligence Committee said in 2018 that the Department of Homeland Security assessed that the searches probably included all 50 states. This is talking about the 2016 election. General election-related web pages, voter ID information, election system software, and election service companies. And we know that a vendor called VR, located in Florida, which produced voter registration databases, was hacked. And in fact, their system was used in Durham, North Carolina in 2016, which had a lot of problems. We don't know if that database had been hacked or not. James Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, said again in December 2018 that Putin again tried to muck around in our elections this last month, talking about the midterms. We are seeing a continued effort around those lines. We know that there are a number of countries that are capable of attacking our elections, including Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. So again, to state the obvious, we don't spend enough money on elections, and election officials are underfunded, understaffed, and under-resourced. They have little to no computer proficiency or computer security expertise available to them because they are so understaffed. They don't have the expertise required to protect their servers in an internet-based election from well-financed adversaries such as hostile countries, political operatives, criminals, rogue hackers. And when you think about major corporations, banks, government institutions that have been successfully hacked, the idea that a local election official could protect that official's system from a major attack well, it's kind of ludicrous. Internet voting has a whole host of vulnerabilities that we all know about. Authenticating the voter is one of them. There could be malware on the voter's device that could change or discard votes without the voter knowing. And I mentioned Jeff Bezos' iPhone as an example for a mobile phone as well. In the work I've been doing, I've noticed, and I think this is still the case, that a lot of people don't realize, people who haven't studied computers don't realize that what you see on your screen of your computer or your phone, whatever it is not necessarily what goes out over the internet. They don't understand how the technology works, so they believe if it's on the screen that it's correct, but we know that that's not the case. So we know that malware on the voter's device could show one thing on the screen and send something else entirely out over the internet. There can also be denial of service attacks, which make it difficult to impossible for voters to reach election officials with their ballots, or their ballots to reach election officials. There can be penetration attacks on the vote servers that are used by election officials. There's, of course, uncertainty because these votes cannot be audited because we don't know if what was received was what was intended to be sent. And if it's automated, it makes vote buying and selling easier, as well as voter coercion. On September 27th, we learned of a major ransomware attack, and this is something else that could be done with elections. Universal Health Services, which is one of the largest healthcare providers in the United States, was subjected to what they believe the Ryuk ransomware attack from a Russian cybercrime group called Wizard Spider. And this group had previously attacked Pitney Bowes and the US Coastal Guard. So imagine if we had internet voting and the election officials' machines were subjected to a ransomware attack. I mean, what would happen? I mean, this is still a concern because we still have to worry about election centers being subject to ransomware attacks. So there are a lot of issues to think about with this election. So I want to talk briefly about mobile voting because mobile voting has been pushed recently by Tusk Philanthropies in particular. And they call it mobile voting and not internet voting because fortunately, internet voting, at least in some quarters, has gotten a bad name. And so they're trying to avoid calling it that. Nonetheless, there are two major vendors, one called Votes and the other Democracy Live. Both have been used for pilot real elections that, again, were funded. A lot of the funding for these elections was provided by Tusk Philanthropies. The vote system The first major security report was done by some MIT researchers who discovered serious security flaws, that the attacker could alter the votes before it's stored in the blockchain. And I should mention that one of the things that Votes touts is that they have blockchain voting, so therefore it's secure. Obviously, blockchains don't add anything to the security of these elections, because blockchains are just a data structure. So the votes may be stored in the blockchain, but if they're altered before they're stored, the blockchain does nothing to help with security. Furthermore, security features can be blocked or disabled. These results were from this MIT study, which was, by the way, unauthorized. Votes attacked the researchers. They claimed that the results were flawed, that the pilots had been safe and secure. And they have recently submitted an amicus in a court case to limit access by researchers under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, even though what the researchers did was totally legal and legitimate. Interestingly, Votes hired a security firm to do another security study, and they hired Trail of Bits. And Trail of Bits not only confirmed the MIT study, but they provided more information and they went public. I was a little bit surprised that they were allowed to go public, because a lot of times these studies are forced to be kept confidential. But in this case, we do know that Votes reviewed, that Trail of Bits reviewed the Votes systems and confirmed that there were some serious security flaws. As I say, Votes touts blockchain voting. And again, to quote the National Academy of Science, in the particular case of internet voting, blockchain methods do not redress the security issues associated with internet voting. Democracy Live has a system called Ballot, which is the electronic ballot transmission system. And on their website, they actually claim that it is not an online voting system. And they argue that their system always generates a paper ballot for tabulation. So therefore, they can do an audit or a recount, even though we know that there's no way to know if this paper ballot, which is printed out from the electronic version that was received over the internet, is accurate. And again, there was another independent security study that found votes can be altered or misdirected from the Democracy Live system without detection. So I want to stop here and just provide this link if you're interested in knowing what kinds of voting systems are used throughout the country, in various states, or down to the county level. And also looking at the timeline going back to 2006, the Verify, which is on the Verified Voting website, provides all this information. It's quite interesting to look at how things have changed over time. So now I'd be delighted to take questions.